We're starting today with a thought partnership and kicking this off about ways we can look at this a little bit differently. How do we take some of the learnings of this community, some of the research, and take that upstream into some of these big tech platforms where a lot of young people are? What are components of those platforms that we can train the folks who are working in trust and safety, the product managers, to think about? I think for this session as well, we're also thinking about the ways that we can take products that are focused on health or on education and that don't necessarily have communities as a primary feature, and how do we build communities as a complementary feature to that work? We see an economic value in doing that. There's virality, there's longer term customer engagement when you have a community that people can coalesce around a product or a service, even if it isn't necessarily social first. We also see obviously the social impact, as this research with Digital Delta has shown us, as well as our earlier research around the causal loop systems map. And there's also an interesting dynamic that if you have a community and they're inputting into your product, you're going to have a product that reflects your community, reflects your users, a product that has the meaning and intention behind it to serve the needs of your users. And so for us, are really excited to introduce you to a couple of the leaders in our community who are thinking about community, who are thinking about these meaningful connections. And so I'll turn it over to Mina, who will introduce them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. I am so humbled and excited to introduce our 4 panelists today who we can learn so much from about building community on online spaces. Starting with Mika Lee John, the CEO and co-founder of the innovation To Swim. We are so lucky that we were able to work with Mika during our first accelerator here at Headstream. Also serves as an amazing Hope Lab fellow and continues to be an active and supportive community member for us at Headstream. I'm also excited to introduce Stephen Wemple, who is an investor with Sparrow Ventures that particularly focuses on investing in things that make life worth living, specifically well-being, work and purpose, and human connections. Nextly, I'd like to introduce Lex Yu, who is an amazing new member of our Youth to Innovator Incubator program. And so they are particularly focusing on building a social technology application for young people of color to be able to come together and share their stories and realities, specifically in neighborhoods and cities in America where there aren't that many access to other youth of color around them. And lastly, but never least, happy to introduce Sean Lee, who has a great deal of experience working at as the Trust, Safety, and Community Director previously at Discord, also with experience at Reddit. And I am just so excited to be able to open up each of you to our community and to learn what does it really mean to build community on digital spaces. And so with that, I'm going to start out our first question to Lex, our Y2I incubator innovator here. And so Lex, I wanted to ask you, since you're building a social tech platform for youth of color that will share their experiences, why do you see a need for digital communities? And what inspired you to build your innovation? And how are you putting that inspiration into the platform that you are building in the incubator program?
Yeah. So what inspired me to come up with this idea is that, especially now that we're in a pandemic, I think everyone can relate to like not having people in real life that like you can sort of talk to. And especially for people of color, like youth of color, when they're growing up, like if there are only a few people who like share your experience around you, you can't really form that community and sort of talk about your identities because you just don't have that language and that community to like support all of that. And that's where online communities really become important, because if you can't find it in person, then like you can find it online. And one way that I hope to sort of build this into the platform is that like I do hope that it can become a place where you can like the focus is on making real friends, not really like how many retweets can you get, things like that, but like actually forming communities with people and getting to know them as people and sharing your experiences.
Thanks so much, Lex. Stephen, we have a question for you. And so curious from Sparrow Ventures point of view and your point of view, you all have been investing in this space for a while. What do you look for when you think about investments and thinking about the community component in those investments? Why do you all value products and services that have a community component? And how do you all distinguish between a community and, say, a little bit of what you've mentioned in the past around a network as opposed, or kind of looking a little bit different than a community?
Yeah, certainly. First of all, thanks for having me. This is an awesome group of people. I appreciate the opportunity to get to share our points of view at Sparrow. So I think first and foremost, we're filtering for purpose-driven companies, and kind of our mandate since day one has been to, think about companies that are using the internet and technology to kind of deliver on its original promise, which is to connect people in better ways. And kind of that's how we first approached kind of thinking about the future of community and where community was going. And I think underlying a lot of the problems that have been created by kind of social media 1.0 and 2.0 is really the misalignment of incentives with the platforms that are hosting kind of social media that we know today, and the end user. And so when we think about community, and companies that are incorporating community in really intentional ways that we want to work with, we're thinking about businesses that have better aligned business models that allow for the business to really think about community in a way that's always going to serve the user. And so for us, that means thinking about it more often than not comes in the form of what we call product-led communities, which are companies that are building a product or a service that are then incorporating community on top of that in a way that allows the user to like 10x their experience, get the utility they're seeking out of going on this endeavor. Whether it's learning something, improving their health, making new friends, so on and so forth, like things that have longer time horizons that typically have lower feedback loops. Community plays a really important purpose. And so for us, it's like we don't think every internet company, every tech company should have a community, or at least they should be honest with themselves and not call what they're building a community. Communities are, really something different than something, and I'll take a step back. We've been investing in the space for about 2 years now. And we were using community loosely. And as we got deeper and deeper and talked to more people that are really like conscious community thinkers and conscious community builders, there's an absolute difference between a community and a network. And it's like kind of like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares type thing. Or what is that the saying? No, all squares are rectangles, not all squares are rectangles, not all rectangles are squares. We'll go with that. Where like all communities are kind of in a network, but not all networks are communities. And communities are very intentional spaces where people, know each other beyond just kind of like seeing their icon and exchanging messages. Communities are places where people are expected to give more than they take more often than not. There's a shared commitment to something beyond why they're there, or a commitment to some greater identity. So I think we want to be more conscious about platforms that are thinking about building communities and thinking about building networks. We love them both because they both have like the economic value that David was outlining. But when you say you're setting out to build a community, that means something really intentional, and that's going to change the way you channel resources to the types of spaces you're building versus if you're building a network. It just is a little bit different. And I think we'll see where the world goes, but a lot of people are jumping into this world of community right now, which is great. It's great. We all need and want more spaces to connect and build relationships, but we're hoping that kind of people do it with a really conscious effort. So that was freewheeling and all over the place, but I hope that answers your question, David.
No, that was wonderful, Stephen. Thank you so much. Something that immediately comes to my mind is the fact that of what you were saying, that this word of community is often used as a blanket statement to describe anywhere where people are gathering. But it's a lot more than that. And there are specific components to be aware of that. And so this difference between a community and a network reminds me of something a very wise person once said about the difference between a town hall and a community center. And so now I'm going to turn it over to that very wise person, Mika. You are an expert at building online communities. You've done this continuously through your innovation to swim, and you continue to do so in all of your different endeavors and ventures. And so I know that there's a lot of intentionality that goes into the way that you create these digital spaces. And so for everybody in the room who is listening, what are some of the foundational components that we should all be thinking about when creating spaces for meaningful connections online? And also, how does your commitment to inclusive design drive those components?
Big question. I have 2 minutes or so to answer it. Is that right? Okay, cool. Also, hi to everybody. I'm like going through all the screens and so excited to see so many wonderful people that I know and many wonderful people I will hopefully get to meet at a later date. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So to briefly and very quickly try to answer a little bit of Mina's question, I think that first, it's not purely only about components, but also about our own thinking. And this comes, of course, extending from what Stephen just said, about how we think about inclusivity and how we think about intentionality. And I think that part of this, when you think about community building, or when I think about community building and like those components, I suggest starting big when you're thinking about what community means for you. Because again, not every community looks the same, nor should it. So if you are running some sort of, I don't know, a tech product, I won't say, give an example, but let's say you have different stakeholders, young people, maybe their parents, and maybe educators. I would start really big thinking about the why. Why are you building this community? What are these different audiences that you need to support? And how can you make sure you're actually creating better resources for them as a community? And in that, inclusion, of course, is actually sort of undergirds all of the things I am saying, but really thinking about, how do we make sure that different audiences and different stakeholders are being seen as with their identities and where they are in life. I think I'm already running over, so I'll go a little faster. The second piece of this I think a lot about is listening deeply. So, if you decide, okay, we have 3 core stakeholders, we need to do surveys with everybody or as many people as possible and figure out what that should look like. I've often, some folks that I've worked with in startup land, say like, okay, we're going to build a community, we're making a forum. And a forum may not be the best medium. Perhaps your stakeholders want to have one-to-one connection and they want to be matched together. Or perhaps you need to create a community space for the educators working with the young people who can then create their own sort of offshoots of what community can look like for your product. So I would think about it really broadly to start and then go much more narrow. And then lastly, and much in the same way that most of us probably build anything, it's a process of testing and iterating. So don't hold anything too dearly to heart, especially in those early days as you're experimenting, because things can change. Suddenly what you're building might be, all of a sudden it's like a very specific demographic is like flooding the product, which is great. And you're able to support their needs, but also making sure you can shift for everybody else on the platform. I'll pause there, but happy to pontificate later with whomever wants to talk.
I love it, Mika. I think it sets us up really nicely for Sean to kind of jump in as we think about going broad and then narrowing down in, and the idea around that communities aren't going to, or the challenge around building a community at the start for everybody and figuring out exactly how to meet the needs of the different types of people in your community. Sean, you have experience building communities, thousands of communities, right? Whether they're on Discord or in the past at Reddit as well. And some have been small, some have been large. A lot of them have been communities that have brought people together that don't know each other, but have brought them together around a passion. And so from your perspective, working on kind of this trust and safety component of building these communities, what are you thinking about for the user to create this type of thriving community, especially for folks that aren't coming to a community around their connections to the other people in that community, but around a product or a service or a passion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I think, to echo certainly everything that Mika and Stephen said. And Stephen, by the way, I love the cat. It was a great cameo of your cat just like running all over your desk. I mean, I think, right, like communities they're really like, in some sense, they're like nested Russian dolls, right? They are a fundamental expression of a facet of your identity, right? And we, humans are very social people, very social creatures. And the idea is that you join communities, both I think online and offline, right? To sort of like find some expression of that interest of your identity. And I think, especially in spaces where you don't know each other, right? You start out sort of with this reliance on like, oh, hey, I like this TV show, I like this music, I like this game, I like this whatever, right? And you chat about that. But I think that the true nature actually of a community, right, sort of versus a network, is that over time it grows to be more than that. It isn't just like, oh yes, we are here to talk about, the latest anime or the latest whatever. And it becomes more of a, oh, okay, like let's talk about each other. Let's talk about our shared experiences. Let's talk about our life. And I think it is that value that sort of drives people coming back to that community. We've seen, certainly at Discord, like time and time again, we would see a server, right, a group start up about a specific topic. But if you sort of peer back in that server like 2 years later, they might still be talking about it, but really what they are now doing is they're talking about each other, right? They're talking about sort of their lives, their shared experiences, and that's the bonds that they've really driven there. So I think that's really important. And it's right, it is about designing those intentional spaces where you're like, okay, like what are people doing here? here? What do they want to get out of this space? And how do we facilitate those deeper connections where they do come back time and time again?
Stephen, I saw you unmute yourself. Are you trying to build off of that richness?
Oh no, I was just going to say that's awesome, and I think you know, that's why we kind of love it from a VC perspective, because the conversation evolves beyond what you're there to do, and it makes it super sticky, and it gets you to keep coming back. And what we hope really is, when it goes back to that business model alignment, if you keep coming back for that thing that you initially joined the community for, you're going to ultimately continue working towards that goal, whether it's losing weight, learning a new skill, I don't know, getting better at gaming, improving your mental health. You know, I think using that you know, peer-to-peer, like peer-based, near-peer learning, whatever buzzword you want to use to get people to keep sticking with it, is really, really important and valuable. And like just a reflection of the way people learn and have always convened and communed over time. So it's nothing crazy. It was awesome. It's also always awesome to hear from people really in the thick of building communities like Sean. So it's cool.
No, this is awesome. I just want to continue having this conversation, and most importantly, I want people to be able to take this and apply it. Each of you come from such really rich and very different perspectives, and we have so much to learn about what does it mean to really build community. And so for the people who are in the room who are looking to build community onto their platforms or in their own lives, where should they start with building online communities? And whoever wants to go can go ahead and jump in, and then so on and so forth.
I have thoughts on this because I think it's also important to identify that everyone has different strengths. So wanting to build a community into your product does not necessarily mean that you should be the only person who has to do it or like should do it. And so, you know, for example, as you can probably tell, I'm a very outgoing, extroverted person. I love meeting people, talking to them, and like holding space for other people to meet each other. But some people might be more introverted. They may be more interested in like the tactical side of things. And so I would also encourage you to really think about how you can even, you know, some of this ties into ambassador programs within a community product. Some of this ties into other team members or advisors you can bring in to support. But I would really encourage you, if building communities is something you want to do, 100% pursue it, but also like tap your network. And as someone, they're not like paying me to say this, Headstream changed my life because it also like put me in a room exactly like this to meet people, to have these conversations, tap the wisdom of this like collective or whatever word you want to use to say about it. Like, everyone in this room knows something about a lot of stuff. And so I think there's a really good opportunity for everyone on this call to, like, you know, play your strengths, but also figure out where you want to fill in the gaps.
I also would just like, Mika or Micah, sorry, what she said in her first answer, which was start with the why. I think you can't underestimate like that is at the core of, I think, what you want to do in terms of your first step. It's like you can bring people together, but if you don't have a clear kind of, you know, a thing that you're shepherding this community towards, whether it's shared learning or expression or, you know, a place for people to share an identity that they don't otherwise get to express, you know, it's really hard to get a community to keep coming back and to kind of blossom into the thing that you want it to. So it's always start with the why. From the homework that I've done, start with the why and then the who, and then really start to like let the community elevate itself and kind of shape its own direction.
Yeah, and I think just a bit on that, like one of the things that I would say is that like in a lot of ways, actually what I would suggest is that you look at the community as a distinct and separate sort of entity than your users, right? Your community is obviously made up of your users, but your community often is a sort of a superset of that and may have actually like specifically different needs, different desires, different wants. So if you're building a product, right, like you can build in sort of real-time interaction in a number of ways. Clubhouse is doing really well right now, et cetera, et cetera. But like, I think there's this sort of question of like, okay, like, right, like if you have a specific community of a specific group of users, what do they want as a community that will allow the community to grow versus what does an individual user want, right? The individual user may want one-on-one conversation. The community may want, you know, event spaces or stuff like that. So it's important to sort of like, I actually think separate it out and be like, do your user research on your users, of course, but also sort of understand the superset of your community and what will drive community growth.
Yeah, and going off of that, like the difference between the individual and the group is that like, for example, if you have like an open platform, like you obviously can't control like who's going to sign up and use it, but what you can control is like how you kind of direct the conversation that's happening like in that space. And so one thing that I've noticed, like as I was thinking about my idea for this incubator, was that a lot of online spaces, although for example, like you can be a person of color and be online, but like a lot of those spaces are just not meant for that, because like people will like retweet it and it'll end up on like Trump Twitter or something. And like you need to like design ways to like keep that from happening. So that's like my 2 cents on like sort of focusing on like who you want to make your space for, and like how are you going to protect them and like their interest in using whatever it is you're making.